David Barclay, and whenever anyone asks me why I'm interested in these issues, why I work on them, I tell them the clue is in the name. My ancestors, I feel like this is a confession here, and my ancestors were the ones who set up Barclay Bank, but the interesting part of that story is that they were Quakers, and as part of their Quaker faith, they had a very strong set of moral values that their business was held within. So there is a story of another David Barclay, my great-great-great-great-grandfather or something, who was horrified when he discovered that the bank owned some property that had slaves working on it. And so he immediately did what was needed to sell the property and to free the slaves and to pay for their transportation to Philadelphia where they could be freed. Now, obviously, over the centuries, some of those moral values at the heart of the financial system have perhaps eroded slightly. And so I feel like my mission is perhaps to try and bring some of that back, or to play a very small part in that conversation. But as well as doing penance for my ancestors, I think I'm probably also here as the kind of unofficial voice of the church to try and explain a little bit, perhaps to answer some of the critiques about the church's engagement in this issue. I actually work for a charity called the Centre for Theology and Community, and we're based in East London, and we exist to help churches engage with issues in their community. And I started working there in 2012 around issues in terms of money and debt, to start to think about how could local churches and how could the church more widely respond to the issues that were coming up in the result of the financial crisis. And the first thing that we did when I started was to think about how we might listen, because for us, that is a crucial part of this process. We never want to go into churches and into communities and tell them what their problem is and tell them how to solve their problem, because actually there's a kind of arrogance there that we know what the real issue is and we know all of the possible solutions that we just don't think works when it comes to engaging with civil society organisations. But listening, getting people to talk about money and debt issues, not always that simple. So we developed a tool called a money talk. And a money talk is a facilitated conversation. It's dead simple, and we run them a lot in churches, but they could be used elsewhere just as easily. And it's about opening up that conversation, getting people to talk about their experiences of money, financial services, to think about what are the practical changes that would make a positive difference, and to think about what the role of their organisation and their role personally in trying to do something about it. And it's been an extraordinarily fruitful tool for us. Firstly, because it uncovered a number of really powerful stories. We've heard some already, but I remember in one of the first money talks that I facilitated, a lady started talking about how her granddaughter had taken out £200 Wonga loan, had ended up with over £2,000 worth of debt, and this grandmother had had to bail her out using the savings that she had wanted to spend on her husband's funeral. That's the impact that we started hearing. But we also heard amazing stories of hope. And as we mentioned already, another early money talk, we actually had someone who had been involved in creating the Hornsey, one of the first credit unions in the country. And they were an Afro-Caribbean lady who could speak with authority on that experience of coming to the UK and doing something about the problems that they were faced with. So there's stories of real problems and issues there in civil society, in the churches, but there's also stories of hope and possibility. And so we heard stories of churches trying to set up their own credit union in an area where there really already was a very good credit union for them to work with. And so that raised the stakes of that conversation. How can we coordinate, facilitate, direct that energy that exists towards the most useful ends? And we came up with three areas of work that we wanted to focus on. The first was around regulation, because it was clear from the stories we heard that some things were happening in this sector, in the financial sector, that just weren't right. And so we worked with Citizens UK, the National Community Organising Alliance, on their Just Money campaign. And we were one of a number of organisations to call for a cap on the cost of credit. And people like Damon and others here today probably very involved in those efforts. which I think have paid paid real dividends, or are starting to pay dividends now. We had some very interesting meetings with Wonga after the cap came into effect, in which they basically admitted openly that they had been pushing credit on people that they knew couldn't afford it, because they could churn them in the system long enough to make money, even if those people would never pay them back in full. So we have started to see some of those really abusive practices curbed. And that is something that the church, even though the Archbishop's line was, of course, we don't want to regulate you out of existence, we want to compete you out of existence. That didn't mean that there wasn't regulation that needed to happen. And actually he played a very crucial role, I think, in that story of getting that cap in place. So the work there is not done, clearly, but we have made some progress. The second area that we wanted to focus on was about how do we support existing alternatives. And that is where this idea of the Church Credit Champions Network came from. It was the idea of creating a network of local churches who wanted to engage on this issue and who might have useful resources for the benefit of local community finance providers, particularly credit unions. And what we've discovered, we're running that now as a pilot in London and in Liverpool, is that there are some really interesting and creative partnerships to be had. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more in the panel session this afternoon. But for example, we've seen churches using their buildings as access points for credit unions into local communities. We've seen skilled volunteers in churches joining the boards of credit union to lend their particular expertise and to improve governance. We've seen churches using relationships with local employers to set up payroll savings deduction schemes. And then we've seen churches just using their word of mouth, their relationships, to sign people up, to get people to save money with the credit union, but also to get people to think about borrowing from the credit union as a kind of fair trade finance and ethical way to use financial services. So there's lots of exciting things happening there, but we recognized from the outset that there was a third thing that was needed as well, which was innovation. And we started working with a guy who was a former partner at Boston Consulting Group, a very skilled man, who had made a slightly unusual career change of wanting to become a vicar. And so he was quite interested in this whole question and inspired by the Archbishop. And his idea was to take the London Mutual payday model, which was mentioned earlier on, this credit union payday loan, and to think about how that system could be adapted into a CDFI kind of model, so it could be scaled and so it could be priced in order to at least break even. And so we've been working with him to think about how he might be able to work on that, and he's now partnering with Street UK, who are a Street CDFI in the West Midlands, and they're looking to develop that product and pilot it later on this year. But what was interesting in going through that process alongside him, and in learning about all of the other amazing kind of pockets of innovation that are happening here, is this thing that you're probably feeling from listening to these presentations, that there's nothing coordinating it all. There's nothing that's bringing it together, that's helping us learn the lessons, and that is acting as a real advocate and champion for the whole community finance sector. It's very fragmented, and there's some brilliant people, but they're having to plough their own furrow, and it's really difficult, and they don't have the support that they need to achieve what they could. And so alongside Citizens UK again, but then also working with lots of other organisations, we've been trying to develop a proposal for what we're calling a community finance foundation, which would do some of what Damon said, and use our idea is to use banking fines in order to create a pot of money that could be used to do three things: to do some capacity building, so some best practice sharing, research, that kind of activity, strengthening governance, some grant funding or kind of first loss protection, and then some low-cost investment capital. And we think that combination could be catalytic for some really exciting change, and could also bring some others, maybe other banks or other social investors, to encourage them into this space. So it's not a full Community Reinvestment Act, but we think it's a step in that direction to get the principle of taking money that the banks are having to pay out in massive amounts of fines for misbehaviour, and to use it to try and create sustainable change in the community finance sector. So if people are interested in that idea, then please do come and talk to me about it over lunch or another time. Thank you very much.